Well, I'm Andy Tirrell. I'm now working in environmental studies as faculty this year. I've actually started last year, but I've gone full time this year. So I'm right here at Tufts, and I've also been at Tufts for a number of years because I'm finishing a PhD program in the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Before I came back to academia, I was a human rights lawyer for a number of years. So I worked a lot in small communities, especially when I focused on indigenous rights, which I did for much of my career before coming back to Tufts, or coming to Tufts, I should say. So this research doesn't exactly fit with my former life because I used to focus on the environmental impacts of development projects, things like hydroelectric dams or mines. I've now started focusing on access to resources. So instead of looking at how environmental impacts can negatively affect small communities, I'm starting to look at how small communities are affected by access or sometimes limited access to resources. And I'm focusing my current research project on fisheries. And, well, we'll start by mentioning that this is a place that's overly sentimental to me. This is where I first started my research. It's a place called Blake in Norway, and it's very typical. So when I talk about traditional communities, I'm talking both about what some people might imagine, maybe an indigenous fishing community or something that you would think of when you think of the markings of traditional communities. You're thinking maybe, thatched roofs or something like that. There are some interesting parallels in Norway, though, and we'll get to them. But this is a small town. It's traditional because people have been more or less fishing these waters for well over 1,000 years. The town has not become much bigger in that time. As you can see, these are modern boats, so they're no longer going out in wooden boats, of course, although you still have a few of those. But people have kept alive the tradition of fishing on a relatively small scale. I say relatively because when you hear the numbers, it sounds huge. When you think about pulling in tons of fish, that sounds big. But people have been pulling in tons of fish for a very long time in northern Norway. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the project. The project is looking at sociocultural institutions and seeing how they affect fisheries management. Each of these photos represents a different case study in my project. I wonder, does anybody have any idea? Can anybody guess the different case studies? I think one of these photos might be very familiar. Yes. That's Gloucester, so that's representative of New England in general, where I'm doing a lot of work, but Gloucester's a big part of that. What about this lower left-hand? Maybe you could guess. That is New Zealand, yes. So I'll be working in Maori communities in New Zealand. That will start in December. This last one, by default, of course, is Norway again. That island, and I just happened to get there at the very right moment. It's called Blakesoya. It means the island off the coast of Blake, and it's home to, in the summer, 250,000 puffins. Now, they're not all there at the same time, but over the course of the summer, 250,000 puffins make their way there. So it's pretty remarkable. There are only 400 people. When you think about the people to puffin ratio, it's pretty incredible. The idea behind talking about sociocultural institutions, it really came from noticing that most of the time when we talk about natural resource management, and especially when we talk about fisheries management, the assumption about why something is going right or going wrong is always, it's what we're doing. Let's figure out what the policy is. Maybe it's not working. Let's do a large end study, get a lot of samples, look at all of the different fisheries policies over the globe, and we'll run it through a regression, do a quantitative analysis, in other words, and figure out which ones are the best. And then we'll know what to do. And a lot of studies have come out saying, well, something using a quota or catch share system, and there's some conflicting evidence there, but either way they're pretty similar, something where you divvy up the commons, divvy up the fish that are available, and try, assign rights to those fish to various fishermen. And that's the best way, at least if you're trying to achieve sustainability. The problem with that is we've tried different versions of this in different places, and it doesn't work the same at all. And a big part of why it doesn't work, and a big part of the story that you might be familiar with if you read newspapers around here, that fishermen don't really like it all the time. And it's got me to thinking, is it really true that in the places where it doesn't work, fishermen don't like it, and in the places where it works, somehow fishermen like it? In other words, is it that the policy is good and it fails because of something that's happening on the ground? So I started thinking, maybe it has a lot more to do with this fisherman response than the policy itself. Maybe in a vacuum, divvying up, and it makes sense, divvying up access to the fish would work perfectly everywhere, but it's not how we're doing the policy side, it's the engagement with fishermen. So I started thinking more and more about sociocultural institutions. What that means is there are formal ones. There are things like community groups, unions, churches. Those are formal institutions, places where society and culture come together, where some people would say culture is formed or traditional culture is passed on. But there are also informal institutions. That means things like norms, values, what you think about the world, what you think about nature, what you think about your government. So I started to ask the question, are those actually more important than the policies themselves? So here in New England, where we have not had tremendous success, either if you look at the ecology, of course, cod are no longer in Cape Cod, at least in great numbers. Or if you look out on the social side, the political side, you see fishermen are always quite unhappy. In Norway, there has been great success, and the big question is it because fishermen there are happy? So I developed this question, and we'll start off formally, and for those of you who are going on to do theses, this is maybe something you'll become familiar with. You come up with a research question, and then you develop some hypotheses. You might have one that is your main hypothesis, but you try to develop all the different possible explanations or answers to your question. So this question, how do differences in sociocultural institutions affect the success of national fisheries regimes at securing local compliance and cooperation? Now notice, when I talk about success, I've defined it as really socio-political success, securing cooperation. I'm going to assume that the people in the national offices have thought about the ecological side, and the assumption I'm running with is that they're probably right. They figured out the stocks pretty well, and if everything went according to their plan, they would get it right. Now that may not be true, but I'm not trained as a fish ecologist, so I'll leave that to fish ecologists to figure out if that's true. But assuming it's true that they've got a pretty good plan, and I think we have evidence that their plans are often pretty good, are they successful at taking that plan and getting people to comply and cooperate? The difference between compliance and cooperation is compliance just means you don't break the law, whereas cooperation means you might go farther than that. You might only not break the law, but you don't try to do anything to stop the law. You don't protest. You don't file a lawsuit. You don't go to the media. You cooperate. You say, okay, that's the law. Not only am I going to follow it, I'm going to make sure other people follow it maybe. I'm going to keep an eye out for people who are breaking the law, and I'm not going to try to do anything to undermine the law. And I came up with several hypotheses. One is that this kind of compliance and cooperation is based primarily upon local sociocultural institutions. So that was the idea I started with. That's, in some senses, my main hypothesis, that this compliance has more to do with local cultural values, other kinds of informal institutions, than it has to do with the actual policy. Put another way, you could come up with a wide range of policies in New England, and fishermen would probably always be a little peeved. So it's not the specific policy, it's that there is a cultural value about how you interact with the government and how you accept regulations, and I'll talk a little bit about that and why that may be true. But I had to come up with other possible answers. What seems to be the prevailing answer right now is hypothesis 2. Cooperation is based primarily upon the design, implementation, and enforcement of regulations. It's the regulations that determine whether people will cooperate. That's what most people would assume right now. A third hypothesis, the key factors vary, so you can't generalize this. In some places, it's about the policy. In other places, it's about the culture and the social factors. And a really dispiriting fourth hypothesis, if this is true, then we'll just throw up our hands in the air. There's no consistent factor. We don't know. It just changes all the time, which would be bad because it wouldn't help us at all in policymaking if we couldn't identify a good point to try to make a difference. So before I just briefly talk about my methods, this is a pretty typical in northern Norway, and I'm talking about Norway because I've just come back from that research, and so my head is in that data right now. That's a pretty typical ship. It's on the larger side for some of the small communities, but it's on the smaller side in comparison to the big fleet that does a lot of the fishing. It's actually pretty huge, and you can tell in a sense because we're there. I'm snapping the photo. Those are two of my interviewee subjects, and we're inside here. So if you get a sense of how big that room is, you can get a sense of how big the whole thing is. It's pretty big, and yet that's considered a medium size, I guess you'd say, ship. So I was interviewing people. It's qualitative methods that I was using. So it means that I'm trying to get rich detail rather than just some facts and figures. So I do ask questions that could be quantified. You can ask questions about how much you catch on I don't know, a weekly basis, what the price has been, things like that, and I can then turn and take that data and those data and quantify, use quantitative analysis to do something with them. But that's not primarily what I'm interested in. I'm interested in a richer view into the problem here. So I have pretty open-ended interviews. I do have a list of questions that I use, but I also let the interviews go where they may, and I sometimes leave out questions if they're not relevant. The idea here is to try to identify the best information I can get. Again, if people on the quantitative side would not like this, they would say you want to keep everything the same. But as soon as you start asking questions from a form, I can tell you it changes the nature of the conversation a lot. If I'm not sitting there with a coffee like I was with these guys and saying, hey, tell me what is it like to fish? They'll just get going, and they'll talk for 3 hours if you don't say I've got another appointment. But if I ask them these set questions, they answer and stop. And it really changes the kind of information that you get. Now there's a way of, I'm trying to do a bit of a mix. I do want to have some structure. I want to have questions that I make sure to ask everyone, but I don't want it to feel structured that way. And I want to be able to ask questions in unique settings too. Sometimes I can't even sit in a cabin like that, let alone an office. Sometimes we're on a dock. Sometimes we're out on the boat while they're fishing because these people are busy. And they'll say, I don't have time to stop, but if you want to come with me, we can have a chat. It's really hard to do a very formal interview when somebody's pulling up crab traps. It just doesn't work that well. So you have to just take what you can. It's ethnographic work. So it's out of the discipline, the traditional discipline of anthropology or sociology, but it's a different kind of ethnographic research, vertical slice ethnography. Has anybody even heard of that? It's not a super common technique. It's common only when you want to look at systems. And the idea behind the vertical slice is that you take a slice of a system that you think is of interest to you. In this case, the fisheries management system is of interest to me. You start at the bottom, or you could start at the top. I think there are reasons to start at the bottom. You learn everything you can about that bottom layer. So in other words, instead of being ethnographic about a group of people, you're ethnographic about people within a system. So you say, let's look at the low-level fishermen, the ones who are going out on the boat for a few hours. They don't even have the kind of boat you can really overnight in. They're pulling in less fish than most. And then we'll ask them what they think and find out about their lives and move up. Bigger fishermen, fish factories in these towns. We'll get to the town level, talk to maybe even politicians, and move up. We'll get to the regional level, whatever that is. This could be a state level here in the US. In Norway, it's county, but their counties are like states. They're huge. And finally, we move up to the capital cities and the ministries and find out what they think. The idea is to try to diagnose what's happening in the system. If it's not working, where's the disconnect? When you think about Elinor Ostrom, who I think some of you are familiar with just because I know that you've read Elinor Ostrom's work in my classes, then you'll think about nesting. That we're actually looking at how these various levels are nested within each other to try to understand the interactions. So the case studies, as I mentioned, I just came back from Norway. It was my second research trip to Norway. If I had, this doesn't have a pointer function, does it? Oh, does it? Okay, let's see if I can make this work. All right, perfect. So I started in the communities of Andenes, Blake, and Normela. which are in Nordland County. Nordland County is around here. I was actually right there on that island. So the Arctic Circle is right here. It's kind of between these two parallels. So this is roughly the Arctic Circle here. So above the Arctic Circle on this island, kind of on the tip. And the reason why that's an important fishing area is because the continental shelf is kind of right here, and it's closest right there. The continental shelf is a really rich area. It's an area where you have a lot of marine life activity because you have migrations that go right along the shelf. So you have smaller fish who are being pursued by bigger fish who are being pursued by whales. So there's a big whaling center there too, sadly, and then a whale conservation center, and they're kind of at odds with each other for obvious reasons. So these communities are rather small. Andenes is about a couple thousand. It has a big fishing port, though. It has a big factory to land fish. Blake was the one that I said I started in. That was 400. It used to have factories, even small. Factory, we think of something very big. What they mean by a factory is a big room where people were cutting fish and kind of getting it ready to be sold to market. So it used to have that, and a lot of these smaller towns used to have their own factories, but not anymore. And we'll talk about why that is. And then Normalo is just south of Blake, and that's something that is on the rise. So what's happening in Normalo, which is a prominent person kind of gobbling up everything in the town and becoming the only act in town. So one person who owns the factories, who really owns many of the boats and leases them out. And that's a mixed blessing. Some would say better that than somebody from outside the community, and others would say, well, this is not, we used to be a pretty egalitarian community, and things are getting to be very different. Now, that was 2 summers ago. This past summer, I was even further up here, right at the tip, so pretty high above the Arctic Circle. You can see Boatsfjord there. You can actually see the name of it, and Varda, which are 2 of the communities. I was also in some Sami communities. Sami are an indigenous group that live in northern Scandinavia. They have pretty well-developed rights systems. They have their own parliaments in many of those countries, not Russia, but in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, I believe they each have their own parliament. And they're divided. Most people might think of them as Laplanders. They're traditional reindeer herders, but there are also the Sea Sami, who are traditional fishermen, who are gradually who have become more integrated into Norwegian society than the reindeer herders. And so that's in Alta, which is over in this area. So this whole area is Finnmark, and then we've got Nordland there. But I also did research down, all the way down, in Oslo at the Ministry of Trade and in Bergen at the Directorate of Fisheries. So that was getting to the top level of the vertical slice. And I thought it might be interesting to see some big photos of these places just to get a sense of what they're like. This is Blake, where I started out. I kind of went out onto a long peninsula, and you can see it's kind of shaky because I'm balancing myself on a rock and about to fall in the water, which I narrowly averted. But it's a small town. It's a quaint, charming town. It's pretty remote. And what's kind of amazing about Blake is it's a town that should not be there anymore. The story of Blake is that the story is really the story of many small towns, fishing towns in Norway, which is once you get to a point where you don't have not that economic activity, the government starts to pull the plug on you. And the fastest way to pull the plug is to get rid of your schools. And so Blake actually had its schools decommissioned. It's not that bad. It seems like it's not that bad. It's only about 10, 15 kilometers to Andenes. You know, that's like, 10 miles at worst, maybe 8 to 10 miles, something like that, or 7 to 10 miles. And so everyone was just expected to drive their kids, or maybe they would have even sent a bus to Andenes, this next bigger town, which still had schools. But the people of the town joined together and now have been running their schools on a volunteer basis for the past several years, which has truly saved the town. Because yes, people might have just driven their children to a nearby town, but the history of other towns like it suggests that over time they would lose population, and and you're already at 400. You get smaller and smaller, and if you lose somebody who owns one of the businesses, it's an even less appealing town to live in, and it's a downward spiral. So they've saved the town in some ways by continuing to run the school. Retirees or people who can take the time, sometimes fishermen in the off season, will say, well, in the off season, I'll teach at the school. And their schools are actually outperforming the schools in non-indigenous, which is another surprise. So in comparison to Boatsfjord, which is the largest fishing port, even though it's also not that huge, population of 2,000, Blake is tiny. As you can see, there are lots of boats in Boatsfjord, which indeed in Norwegian means fjord with lots of boats. That's why it's called Boatsfjord. It's spelled with one of those funny A's with an O over it, so it looks like Botsfjord, but they pronounce it Boatsfjord, and our word boat comes, almost directly from that. You can thank the Vikings for a lot of words in our language. So it's a pretty big place for a small place. There are several fish processing factories, which is rare nowadays, especially in a place that's not a giant city. And Norway doesn't even really have giant cities. The entire population of Norway is smaller than the population of the Metro Boston area. So spread over a gigantic country, under 5 million people, or right around 5 million people. But you can see it's not so different in the size of boats. There are some big ones, and some, especially Russian boats, come in. And there's an interesting story, if I had all the time in the world, that I would tell about cooperation between Norway and Russia over fishing. And really how Norway said, look, you can fish in our waters if you stop fishing the too young fish in your waters. So that was the problem, is that all the fish were all too young in Russian waters. And it's a true mutual gains negotiation when a country says, yeah, we'll open up our fishing to you because it's better for us that you fish here. And it's a real success story. Boatsfjord is pretty close to the Russian border. I don't know if that was evident, but, oh, now I've done it. I don't know if it's evident, but when you get over here, that's the Russian border right there. In fact, I was, for a while, doing research close enough, like Sarah Palin, I could see Russia out my window. So it's pretty close. Now, another community, a place like that I didn't even mention because there are a bunch of small communities I worked in that if I listed them all out, it would take a lot of time. It's a place called Coon Stuart, Kingsfjord. It looks like there's stuff happening there. There are still some boats there. All the factories are gone. It's what should have happened to Blake. With the factories, and maybe a point of clarification, Blake still has boats but no factories because Andenes is close enough that you can land the fish 11 kilometers away. That's not so bad. Kungsfjord is not so lucky. And basically, there are no commercial fishing boats left from a place that used to have 19 processing factories. Think about that, 19 separate factories down to 0. It's more of a summer tourist town now with a small population that stayed. So it looks like a great place to do fishing. It has a fairly big dock that I'm standing in the end of. It has a smaller dock for smaller boats, but they're just there for recreation and tourism now. And then but it still exists as a city, which is more than you could say for Hemmingsford, which it's there, but nobody lives there. It's a ghost town. I did speak to some folks there. It's the kind of place you go, kind of like Sturbridge Village, except there are no reenactors. Sturbridge Village is a reenactment place. People go and wander around the old building. Some people have their family houses and they go back and stay there for a few days, but there are no amenities in town. And you're about a 45-minute drive to the nearest town. So it's like camping, more or less. And it happened in 1965 because the government just sort of abruptly shut down the school, refused to, well, it's a long story, but to get the kind of fishing boats that you started to use in that time into the harbor, you'd need to dredge it in a new way, and refused to do that, and that killed the town. They were dependent upon fishing, but nobody could use the newest technology, and they didn't have a school anymore. I think some people continue to live there, and the church had a sign that said our last service was, and they had a photo of the 3 people sitting in the church for the final church service in 1973 or something like that. So 3 old-timers, two siblings and another person stayed on for the bitter end. Other case studies here, as I mentioned, Gloucester, New Bedford, Chatham out on the Cape, to get a real sense of different sizes, all very productive ports, all facing similar problems. And then communities in Maine, Indian Township, Sabaik, Portland, and Stonington. The idea behind this is to make a true comparison with Norway, where I'm talking to both indigenous Sami people and ethnic Norwegians. There is an indigenous component to this research. And the idea behind that is to figure out if there are cultural norms that are determining whether the regulations are working. Then maybe I can test those norms within a country by looking at two very different cultural groups. I'll explain this a bit more when I get to the questions. Finally, there is a New Zealand case study, but trying to figure out exactly where to go. We've identified Bluff as a really good candidate. Anybody who might know about New Zealand, I would really like any suggestions of good, smaller fishing towns. We don't want huge cities, but smaller fishing towns. So if you've been to New Zealand, if you're a Kiwi fisherman especially, please talk to me. I don't know, what are the chances? But I'll tell you why I say that. 2 summers ago, when I knew I was going to start this research in Norway, and I knew I wanted to go to Nordland, that county up just above the Arctic Circle, I sent out an email to everybody I knew who was Norwegian, and I said, is anybody from northern Norway? Got a couple of responses. Most Norwegians are from Oslo or Bergen or Trondheim, these bigger cities. But I got a couple of responses, and I said, well, actually, I really like to go to these islands right off the coast. And it turned out the person that I only knew, and I was actually a pretty good friend of hers, but all I knew is that she was from Norway. It turns out that she is from that town of Blake. So I identified basically a couple of islands, and in my friend group happened to find somebody from one of those islands. So you just really never know. And I ended up, I'll show you the house where I ended up staying, which is the oldest house in town that belonged to her grandmother, and now is more or less a town museum. So you never know. It can't hurt to ask. So I'll talk about preliminary findings, but the idea behind this is, as I mentioned, to try to figure out if Norwegian fishermen what they would say about the regulations, and then what they do in response to that. Having not done the formal research here in New England, but knowing a lot about the problem, I feel pretty confident about what New England fishermen say. They hate the regulations, they think they're unfair, they think they're unfounded, and they do a lot about it. Not everyone, but there are significant activities all the time. Talking to the media, getting politicians involved. You cannot find a Massachusetts politician who hasn't said something that's pro-fisherman. It's really hard anyhow. Most of them, even ones who you think of as being very environmentally progressive, will basically say, oh, we don't know enough information. We don't have enough information about fish stocks, so we shouldn't regulate the fishermen so hard. Even the very progressive ones. So Barney Frank, for example, is pretty environmentally progressive, but talks about the fishermen all the time. It's a very divisive issue in the state. So the findings in what totaled to be 3 months of field work in Norway after nearly 100 interviews. I asked about their satisfaction with the regulations. I asked about what are the specific issues that you care about, and what is your reaction to any dissatisfaction? Do you protest? Do you get involved in politics? Do you file lawsuits? Anything? Do you do anything? Do you talk to your local fishermen's union representative? There was a high level of dissatisfaction. So even though it seems like everything's going well in Norway, almost everyone is unhappy about the regulations, and not just in a minor way. Not just in oh, I wish I could make a little bit more money. Had really serious and actually pretty well thought out complaints about the system. So quota alienation was the biggest complaint. What that means is, the fancy way of saying, smaller fishermen are selling these quotas to bigger guys. So this bears a little explanation. A quota is something that gives you the right to fish a certain amount of fish. So it's basically like a license. It's like a fishing license, except for people who are fishing tons of fish. They were given out when a new system came in place in 1990, and they were given for free to people who were actively fishing. Since then, those free quotas have gone up to have value in the millions for each one. So imagine this, you were a relatively middle class, at best, fisherman in 1990, and somebody handed you a lottery ticket, basically, just for being a fisherman. And now 20 years later, 20 some odd years, but it started about 5 years ago, that these young fishermen, and I say fishermen a lot because, to be honest, it is a very gendered profession in Norway, and in the US for that matter. I interviewed 100 different, I've interviewed plenty of women who are involved in the fishing industry, but among the actual fishers, we'll say that for the purpose of explaining this, I could not find one person who was willing to talk to me that was a woman, and I only had one woman that was even suggested to me, and she didn't want to be interviewed. Probably because she figures I'll keep my head down and not say too much because this is not a very friendly profession for women. So we can talk maybe another time about why that is and what can be done or if something should be done about it. But when I asked the question, would you want your children to become fishermen? And then specifically, somebody might say, well, I only have a daughter. And that was considered an adequate answer. Well, what about your daughter? It was usually a laugh. No, that's not, no, that doesn't happen. So fishermen, and unfortunately is an apt term. When I asked, so talking about these quotas, they became worth millions and millions. And once these fishermen got to a certain age, they thought, I want to retire. What better way to retire than sell this thing I'm not going to use anymore because I'm retiring for millions? The problem is, you look around your community, there aren't so many people with millions except the other people who have a fishing quota to sell. So who do you sell it to? You sell it to a big boat, a big company that owns a big boat and can stack a bunch of these quotas on the same boat. In theory, this was not supposed to happen. The quotas are supposed to be attached to the boat. And you might, if you're like me, you'll be amazed at the response to this loophole. A gigantic loophole that in the U.S. would have been challenged in court years ago. Fishermen began selling the boat to bigger companies, and then the boat was deemed to be junk, and the company got to keep the quota and put it on a new boat, which was a bigger boat. Now, often these junk boats were fine. The company was willing to eat the value of the boat in order to get the quota. So they were circumventing the law just by creating a legal fiction that the boat was junked. And the law of course wanted you, if your boat sunk, to be able to put the quota on a new boat. So they really used a giant loophole, and nobody's closed that loophole in all these years, even though it's causing all of these towns to lose quotas. So when the quotas go out of town, so do the fish that are being landed. That's why the factories are closing. The factories close and people leave, and the towns shrink, and some of them die. And yet, it's the biggest problem everybody cited, very little response to it. Price fluctuations, unanticipated regulations are other problems that are brought up. And seismic testing, what do you think seismic testing is for? Does anybody have a guess? In the context of Norway, it's oil testing. So to test for oil, they do these seismic shots, and they can then tell if there's oil down there. And most fishermen think it's scaring the fish away, at least for weeks at a time. But when I ask follow-up questions, especially about this big issue of quota alienation, well, what do you do? Very little. What would you like to do? Or what might you do in the future? Nothing. Nothing. Very, very little. Almost no activity except by a few. And looking at societal observation, which means reading the newspapers or seeing what's going on in town, there isn't anything happening. It's just not just that my interviews are coming out this way. Nothing is happening on the town level to challenge. And this is the largest fishing port in Norway, remember. Largest by volume, not by population, but by the number of fish landed, the largest one in Norway. So then I asked, well, why not? You're really upset. You think this is not just bad for fishermen, but destroying communities. Why wouldn't you do something about it? And these are some of the answers that were given. That's not the right way to handle the problem. You have to trust the government to find a solution, even though everything is trending in the wrong direction. A guy who actually had it was Norwegian, but had his big break in the U.S., guy named Ruka, who owned American seafood and now owns Norway Seafood, has now collected 40% of cod quotas in all of Norway under his company. So we went from a system where, remember, the quotas were given to each individual fisherman, so they were dispersed among a large number of people, and now they've been collected, so 40% are in the hands of one person, and it's growing all the time. But still, people say you got to wait, the government will do a good job, you got to trust them. You don't want to stick out or be seen as a complainer. You don't want people to think bad things about you because you're whining. And people sometimes, often, actually, not just sometimes, often said, I don't know what my neighbors would think about me if I started going to the press or if I joined this political party or I joined a protest. It's funny that neighbors came up quite a bit. And the really funny thing is, it's not the Norwegian way, and people often then say, well, it's not like what you guys do in the U.S. We don't do that. And some people talk about France a lot. In France, they'll throw milk in the streets if the farmers are upset, or fish in the streets, but we're not going to, that's not what we do. And in fact, if you look at the history of these kinds of protests in Norway, you can find a couple of examples under extreme circumstances, but it's not so common. So there were a few people. There are always individuals who behave differently. There were a few people who joined political parties. There is a fringe political party called the Coast Party that is about fishermen's rights, but is also, I don't know, in some ways it reminds me of the Tea Party in that it's extremely right in almost every way. And it's all about individual liberties, personal liberties, and things like that. But one of those is we should be able to fish as much as we want. It's our right to do that. And there were a few people, and you can imagine Norway is a kind of a socialist country, although it's now leaning the other way. There's a conservative government in place, which is way more liberal than our liberal party. So, but still, for Norway, it's pretty conservative. Those few people who are willing to join that party, or the ones who are not even political explicitly, but are just about fishing, who would protest or who would go to the media and do interviews, most people think they're right about fishing, not about other things, but about fishing, or at least think they have a point, especially with things about the quotas are leaving our towns are dying. But most people would not be willing to follow them. They're being too extreme. I would never vote for a person like that. They need to let the system work. And mostly they're too loud and out there. So we're not just talking about the extremist politicians. That's only one breed, but just people who are going and doing newspaper interviews and saying, it's really hard because the town's dying, and we can't do anything to stop it because the quotas are leaving, which means the fish are leaving. Even a very moderate interview like that, people thought was just too out there, too extreme. So the next step is to take this data. I mean, there are a lot of next steps, but take this data and compare it to the data that's collected here, which I suspect will confirm, but you never know until you do the research, but you suspect will confirm that U.S. fishermen are not afraid to speak up, and it's thought of as a positive trait to be the one who speaks up. That those are leaders in the community, the ones who stand up to the government. Those are the ones who represent the people rather than being the outcasts or the ones who are thought of as too extreme. Then really it's sociological now, and the same thing in New Zealand, which is in a moderate position, or at least is expected to be in a moderate position between Norway and New England, the U.S. Then the question is why? And there are lots of possible, and I'm hoping we can have a little bit in the question period, a little bit of discussion. There are lots of possible answers that you might imagine, but in general, the U.S. is a country of exceptions. American exceptionalism is a phenomenon that comes up in all different places, and we are not afraid to be, as a people, the ones who stand out, and as individuals too. We're a country, even in areas that are quite conformist, it's still a very respectable thing to stand out in the right way. We're also a country that is somewhat distrustful of the government, and I suspect that this goes back to the colonial beginnings, that the kinds of people who came to America as immigrants were people who were comfortable with questioning the government, or even believed that the government had been a tyrannical force, and those thoughts still permeate our society in some ways. We are still very distrustful of the government. When something's going wrong, it is not our natural response to say, give it time, the government will get it right. That is not usually our response to bad stuff happening. It's usually get them out of there, revolution time, at least a political revolution. Actually, disturbingly, more and more people, hopefully in the extreme, but recently I've been talking about real revolution again. When this Second Amendment stuff comes up, some people are saying we need guns, we might have to have a revolution soon. So definitely very different there. So if this is the case, if it's the case that the U.S. is uniquely, or at least in comparison to a place like Norway, unwilling to let the government be in the driver's seat, distrustful of any of that activity, and willing to protest, to undermine government regulation, to do everything if that's how Americans are, and especially American fishermen, everything in their power to push things in the direction that they think is right, it's quite possible that we can't model our system after Norway, and have a good result, because that is very much a command and control system, meaning the Norwegian government sets the rules and it's expected that everyone will follow them. The other side to this is that the Norwegian government has always been, historically going back, very willing to engage with fishermen. So another possible explanation is the engagement has been much, much better. That maybe now there's a disconnect. Maybe now you have one guy who's taking control of all these quotas and the fishermen are not being heard, but there was enough trust built up in the past. It used to be that the fishermen had the power when it came to setting rules. It's only when the recent, that is recent going back to the 1990s, realization that things weren't sustainable that caused the government to sort of really take control and say, no, we can't just do what the fishermen want. So it's possible that there was a lot of goodwill built up, and that's still somehow holding a little bit of sway. And I think it's possible that slowly we're approaching a point in Norway where fishermen will start to want a little bit more control back. But still, it's a very, very deep divide between Norway and the US. I'm looking forward to the research, which will be happening in the fall and spring, to confirm that in the US, but I've done some preliminary interviews, and so far there's nothing that I found that would suggest it's not true, that US fishermen, especially New England fishermen, are willing to protest, think it's a good thing to stand up to the government, and are highly skeptical about the regulations. There'll be research, as I mentioned, in New Zealand, December and January. There's been some proposed Alaska research. I'm trying to balance between the very interesting information that could come from that and the very real amount of time that would take, and whether it's realistic, but it could be very interesting. And then the idea is this is my dissertation, and hopefully the idea is to finish by May, but to convert it into a book manuscript. So ultimately, the hope is that this is something that could be published and could directly affect policy, either through a series of articles, but also possibly through a book that more broadly talks about natural resource management, maybe with a focus on fisheries, but the problem of engaging communities and how those socio-cultural fits between communities and the regulators are in many ways much more important than the policy design that we put so many resources into. So that's basically the idea. Hope you'll have some questions. And yeah, thanks. And I learned at some point you always have to end with a cute animal. So this is a reindeer. They're all over the place in northern Norway, and they're thought of as a nuisance. People just hate them. They're in the road all the time, blocking traffic. They come through and eat anything you can manage to grow in the Arctic soil. So I think they're kind of, I don't know, I grew up wanting to see reindeer, of course, as a kid. So I was always really excited to see the reindeer, and everyone else is just shaking their head around me. So, all right, any questions? Yes, me. Yes. Well, Hawaii, it turns out. So I did a bout of Hawaii research. That will probably be an epilogue, because Hawaii is just getting to the point where regulations are coming into effect. And in fact, the interesting finding from Hawaii was that Native peoples in Hawaii are welcoming in federal level regulation because they feel that the state has really abandoned them, or really abandoned is not the right word. The state was never with them. So it's an interesting place, but the problem is that the regulations aren't really strong enough there yet to see the right response. So they're just getting to the point where they have bag limits on fish. They're really just starting that process. And it's not clear if within this research period they'll get there enough to get a strong enough response. But what could be interesting is to use it as an epilogue where you say, well, now this is the new frontier. This is where you have a chance to get it right. In Hawaii, where you're just starting to figure out how to interact, you could make sure you have meaningful interaction with both native and non-native fishermen in Hawaii. It was a really interesting experience, and I stayed for a long time in an indigenous community there. And well, I wish I had time to go into that, but there's a lot to be said about that. But it did not hook up directly with the other research in an obvious way yet. So I think it will be a good, this is what could happen kind of maybe conclusion to this research project. Yeah, Coco. Yes. Yes, yeah, I'll summarize that. So the question is, can you, if you look at the attitudes, can you see something about the sustainability impact? That is, have the fish stocks done better where the attitudes are better? I hesitate because when you talk about that kind of interaction, the sample size is probably not big enough to say something definitive, but casually I will say this. Norway has really good fish stock management right now. They're, in fact, if anything, the complaint is the quotas have gone too high because there's so much cod and now the price is plummeting. So it's funny, you don't often hear fishermen talk about a problem with too much, we can fish too much, but it's really not, that's not the complaint in Norway because the stocks are so good that they can fish quite a bit. The common thing that's said is we have to fish twice as many for the same money because the price plummeted. But really the issue is much more about who gets to fish, not how much fish you can get, because since 1990, that system has worked really well, and it's why everyone rushed to replicate the Norwegian system. It's worked. Sustainability-wise, it's worked. The stocks are better than they've ever been. Well, that's probably not true. They're better than recent memory, though. And they're good enough to have a pretty high quotas. It's just a shame that those quotas are in so few hands. In the U.S., of course, not very good, at least not in the New England context. It's why Alaska would be an interesting case to look at because things are different there. And New Zealand has done pretty well with sustainability. I'm just kind of sinking my teeth into that part of it, but they've done fairly well. And they've done well with their managing the native fisheries too with the Maori, so that's interesting. Yes? It was really an entitled attitude of, this is our show. Oh, sorry. What is the attitude of policymakers in Oslo and Bergen was the question. They really thought this is our show, and when I suggested, you know, after asking them how they thought things were going, I often would then say, well, you know, some of the fishermen are worried about these problems. What do you think? You know, sometimes they would say, yeah, no, we know, we're gonna handle that, but ultimately it's our show. It's from a government that has been given, you know, a lot of free rein because it's a government that's also been very good to the people. So there's a relationship there where there's a lot of trust put in the government. Therefore, the government can take fairly decisive action, but that action has been not done in a way that's offended most people's interests. In fact, most Norwegians are proud, very proud of their government, and think it's a very good system of governance. So there's a lot of feedback into all of this. So if most Norwegians are proud of the governance, if that's indeed part of their identity, that we are a better than average, in fact, they would say one of the best countries in the world, we've just done it right here in Norway, then it's really hard for somebody like a disgruntled fisherman to say the government's messing everything up, because the societal norm is no, this is what we're proud of. We're proud to be Norwegian in part because of our government. So there's I think a reluctance to criticize something that's been a point of pride for the national psyche. And indeed, things are good in Norway. Everything that you might have heard about Norway being a very pleasant place is true apart from the weather. But everything, which you've probably also heard of, but yeah, it's a very pleasant place, and they do very well by their people. Very few people are really in a state of suffering. You don't see that very often. There are some, and as immigration has increased, the problems have come up that hadn't come up in the past. But in general, Norway has done very well by its people. I think that does play a big role, for sure. That was of great interest to me. So the question is there social pressure that the fishermen should not sell quotas outside of the community? I thought for sure that if I asked about that, people would say, yeah, we were really upset when our neighbors sold the quota to this big company. What I got was a nonverbal, maybe like, yep, and a verbal, well, that's his decision. So I think in a small community, you're reluctant to criticize people around you. Every once in a while, somebody would, if they thought, and I told everyone this is confidential, nobody will ever know what you said. Every once in a while, somebody would say, yeah, but I can't say that I wouldn't have done the same thing in his position. So that's the problem, is everybody imagined what would he do. So what is the alternative? If the quota is worth millions, something to add here to explain why you can't really undo any of this too. Even if the government said, oh, these quotas are worth too much and it's destroying the system. Lots of people have gotten bank loans against the quotas. Lots of people have bought boats, and we're talking about millions of dollars in equipment and boats based upon their quota as the collateral. So if they don't sell that quota for enough money, they can't pay off all the loans they took to buy the big boat in the new year. So a lot of these people don't really have a choice at this point. And the government can't really say, you know what, give us back the quotas. In theory, by law, they could. At any point, they should be able to pull back quotas. But if they did that, it would wreak havoc on the economic system. The bank lobby alone would be furious with that. So it's right now, it's the tail is wagging the dog, so to speak. That even though the government should be able to fix the system, there are too many other variables in play that are forcing everything in a certain direction. And a lot of people just say it's the way of the world. Some people who are really think, well, what do you want? Every other industry has gone this path. You know, you don't have small-scale shoe factories in small towns anymore. I'm sorry, that's just not where we are right now in the world. Why should fishing be any different? Yeah.
I'm wondering about, this might not be in the scope of your research, but maybe you've looked into marine resources for food security. So why don't you that's something?
Well, so as my plan eventually is to take this model and bring it to developing countries where that would be much more of a food security issue. Even you're talking about people fishing for their own food. Most of these fishermen are fishing to export. More than 90% of it leaves the country, let alone the community. Now, there are food security issues in that it's getting exported into where it's mostly not for people who are in a food security kind of dilemma, unfortunately. A lot of it is being exported now to China, in fact. That's the biggest growing market. And that's been a complaint too, that a lot of some people are saying, well, the factories are leaving in small communities. Other people are saying the factories are leaving Norway in general because now you can put a factory in a boat, catch the fish, process it on the boat, and just motor down to China and sell it there. So why would any of this stuff happen in Norway? So the people who are saying this is the natural way of things, some of the response to that is like, okay, great, but that would be really bad for Norway. So maybe we can buck the natural way that the world has been going, because do we really want to lose all of this production to just having it done on boats and being sent to other countries, especially since the appetite from China is big enough that there's no reason anybody would have to land it in Norway and necessarily get it to the European markets. If you have that big boat, it's much more cost effective to just do everything there and bring it to a big market that can absorb it all at once. So yeah, but food security will be an interesting question if you try to apply these same concepts to the developing world. The idea is to develop the theory first and make sure it's sound, and then take on the more complex questions that come up in a developing context, where it's much easier to get data in these contexts as well. Did you have another question? Yeah. Sure. Oh, well, no, that's the interesting thing. I don't even know if that's, yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question, but I haven't seen it. There are many other ways that I've seen community collectives, though, so it's funny that it hasn't gone there. One big, I mean, they're in these prosaic ways, though, like everybody kind of getting together in this town of Blake. That was the one that's kind of surviving with a volunteer teaching force and building what I think of as a pretty high-level soccer pitch. I mean, with really nice lights and beautiful turf. This sounds like a silly thing, but they have a town soccer team that competes against other towns. It's a town of 400. Uniforms. They make their own hats and scarves, in the very typical hat and scarf, like the Harry Potter Quidditch sort of thing. They have their colors, all for this town of 400, and it's everybody pitched in. And it's helped to foot the bill. And people who had skills helped to build it. Other people put money in. So there is that sense of community collective. I don't know if it's if it can't happen in fisheries because of the legal structures or because it's always been a fairly individualistic occupation. And a lot of people are saying the reason why fishing is different from losing other industries is it's cultural, and it's one of the few ways that somebody who has that mindset, who wants to be out in nature, doing their own thing, and is standing on their own 2 feet, it was a beloved thing to be able to buy your own boat, go out fishing, and just be completely self-sufficient. And that's a big part of culture in Norway too, to have that option. That fishermen were always thought of as these self-sufficient types, an archetype of Norwegian society. So a lot of people are saying that's why it's different, and yet you have this contrasting communitarian spirit too. How are we doing for time? I guess we have maybe time for one more question, if there is one, and if not, we can take a break or end it. All right, great. Thanks, everybody.